Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the workshop on reducing red tape, lessons learned from successful state strategies workshop. Before we get started today, a few quick housekeeping tips before we begin. If you'd like to ask the panelists questions during their presentation, you'll be able to submit questions through Pathwell's chat box feature for the session. There will also be time for questions at the end of each presentation for each presenter. To kick off this session, we have Senator Diaz from Florida, who will be moderating the discussion. Representative Tiffany, serving the 7th District of Wisconsin, Alex Adams, who is the administrator for Idaho's Division of Financial Management, and Clint Woods, who is a policy fellow of regulations for Americans for Prosperity. Senator Diaz, if you'd like to unmute your mic and get us started and introduce the first speaker, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, so everyone, welcome, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to have this conversation here today. I think part of the thing we lack a lot of time for is to have these national conversations and have colleagues from across the country having conversations about important topics. And certainly the reduction of red tape and regulations is a huge issue for our economy under normal circumstances. But certainly as we try to come out of this pandemic, I think getting our residents back into employment and having them be able to make a living and put food on the table, it is certainly, I think, has to be one of our missions as legislators, is to get government out of the way and to allow the economy to thrive and individuals to be able to practice freely. In Florida, we've taken on some of these challenges, and last year I was fortunate to sponsor a bill which actually was pretty interesting, because what we did is peel back the entire onion and removed all licensing issues, all licensing requirements for every single occupation in the state. As you can imagine, that caused quite a stir among those professionals that are licensed, including doctors, surgeons, and others. So that was designed to be a conversation starter for us to review every few years what licensing requirements were really necessary, where were areas where was actually a safety issue for the public, and some of those things. But I think in Florida and across the nation, and I'm sure my colleagues that are on here will concur and attest to that, is we can always do more in reducing red tape and getting government out of the way of people thriving, not only in their occupation, but they're in their small businesses, and they really are the backbone of our economy. And unfortunately, it's become kind of a habit in government across our nation where sometimes a lot of times elected officials feel that they just because they're elected, they have to do more. We have to put more laws in the books. We have to put more regulations because we know better to protect the public or what the public needs. And I think it's quite the opposite. Is the ability of a free market economy to function is for government to get out of its way and let the people have the initiative and have the ability to choose for themselves and to make a living and to improve our economy. So I'm honored to be able to be on here with esteemed colleagues from across the country and other experts on this topic. And I'm excited that all of you are able to join us here today. And I would like to really hear from what's going on across the country. So Mike, I don't know if you want to introduce the rest of our panel so that we can start going in that direction.
Yes, I'd like to first turn it over to Representative Tiffany from Wisconsin.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. So I was just elected to Congress back in May in a special election, so serving about 5-6 months out here, and I'm sure hoping to take some of the lessons we learned in Wisconsin out here to Washington, D.C., and because heaven knows we've got a huge bureaucratic problem out here in DC. But I served in the state legislature for 9+ years. I came in the same year that Governor Walker was elected in 2010, when we had that wave across the country, including in Wisconsin. And when I came into the legislature, this is one of the things that I was concerned about the most was regulation. There's so many of our colleagues, and rightfully so, are concerned about life issues. They're concerned about taxes. And those are really very high profile issues oftentimes for conservatives. But I've always thought that the overregulation part of it is the key, costs us more really than taxes. If you ask me, can we cut regulations in half or cut taxes in half, which one would you take? I'd probably take regulations because I think it has a greater impact on us as a result of all those regulations that are there. And heaven knows, Wisconsin, where the progressive era started back in 1911, we have certainly seen our share of overregulation. So we did a few things in Wisconsin. First of all, we started with Act 21, and then we implemented the REINS Act in 2017. Act 21 was put in place in 2011, and I was the sole author. It was a special session bill that was put forward by the governor. I was the sole legislator to sign on to that bill. And what it did for the first time is it made the executive branch accountable for the administrative rules that are promulgated by the governor's agencies. And it was really very effective, so effective that people were suing to stop it and all those other good things. It also put an economic analysis portion into that Act 21. And it has had the effect of really slowing down the administrative rule process where the agencies, if they had a wish list, they would not come to the governor or the legislature. They would just promulgate an administrative rule, and then you would get this finger pointing where the governor would say, well, it's those executive agencies that have been doing that. And the agencies would say, well, the legislature, they can stop it if they chose to. And yet we really didn't have good tools in the legislature to get this done. This gave the legislature some tools. And then we followed it up with the REINS Act, first state in the country to implement the REINS Act. I believe that was in 2017. I was one of the authors. And that took it a little bit further where the legislature can indefinitely suspend a rule. And so there were a variety of things that happened as a result of this, but those two acts really put accountability back into the system, especially for the executive branch, and it brought more authority to the legislature, which I've always thought is very important, really across the country, and certainly out here in Washington, D.C. The legislative branch, whether it's federal or state, we have ceded far too much power to the other two branches of government.
Thank you, Congressman-elect. And I think, just to chime in on that, I also had the opportunity to sponsor legislation, which was similar to that in Florida. We still have work to do there, but forcing the executive branch to be accountable for any time that you put in a regulation, you have to remove two. And so that I think is something that we can use across all states, including Florida. And I think it's the future. I'm certainly relieved to see someone of your position and your philosophy heading towards Congress, because obviously I think we need a lot of help. But I think it's incumbent upon our state legislatures to take back that power from the executive, and especially from the agencies, which is where I think the most egregious things go on, like you mentioned.
Yes, no doubt about it. And there's just a lot of good work that we can do there. For example, on the REINS Act, we put a threshold of $10 million in compliance costs. So in other words, if it's going to cost $10 million for businesses and others across the state to comply with this regulation, there is a more thorough process that has to be gone through to identify how expensive this is. It really puts accountability into this. And while what we refer to as Act 21 in the state of Wisconsin, as well as the REINS Act, have been quite effective. There's a variety of ways, Senator Diaz, that we can go about this. And I just say to people, don't worry about where you start, just get started.
No doubt about that. I think, I think that if we look at how a lot of these things came into effect and how they've built up layers over the years, it didn't happen overnight. It started somewhere. And so to counteract that, I think we have to take the same strategy is if we can't get 60 yards on the play, we have to take 3 yards and take those 3 yards that year and move on and continue to be consistent in the taking of of those regulations and getting them out and really certainly inhibiting the the kind of the bureaucratic power that exists in agencies, especially, I mean, it happens everywhere, the federal government and at the state level. So this again is an important fight that we need to take on at our states and at the federal level. And again, we're very happy to hear you're going to be taking on that fight at the federal level. So, Mike, you want to move on to our next presenter?
Yes, and I'd also just like to remind everyone that if you have any questions for any of our speakers or you'd like to add any comments, that there's a Zoom webinar chat. If you put your questions in there, Senator Diaz or I can ask them to our participants or share them with everyone else at attendance at the workshop. Our next presenter is Alex Adams, who again is the administrator for Idaho's Division of Financial Management. Alex, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Mike, and greetings everybody from downtown Boise, Idaho. I run what's called the Division of Financial Management. It's analogous to the Federal Office of Management and Budget. So develops the executive budget, oversees the budget after a legislature enacts it. And when Governor Little took office in January 2019, he made me administrator. And one of his first moves was centralizing all agency rulemaking under the Division of Financial Management. He saw some wisdom in having the agencies have to ask DFM for both budget and rule requests, and asked us to be the central authority that reviews all rules and screens them prior to publication in the bulletin. Governor Little also issued the Red Tape Reduction Act, which sounds similar to what Senator Diaz spoke about. Every new agency regulation had to be met by a reduction of 2 regulations simultaneously. So when we started this process, one of the things that I think makes Idaho successful, and if you look at the Mercatus scale, we're actually the least regulated state in the country based on word count restrictions. We start with legislative review of rules. If an agency wants to promulgate a rule, there's some nuances, but in general, it cannot take effect until it's reviewed by the legislature. That's a right that's enshrined in the Idaho State Constitution. Any new rule goes to the legislature for review prior to its effective date. The legislative review is not just check the box. We're a part-time legislature from generally January to March. Sometimes it bleeds into April, but usually the first 2 to 3 weeks of any session is review of all rules prior to them taking effect. And our Administrative Procedures Act specifies legislative review. It's designed to ensure that all of the rules that an agency promulgate conform to the intent of the statute that the rule is promulgated under. And similar to what Congressman Tiffany said, I think this serves as a powerful deterrent. Agencies have to wrestle with anytime they're promulgating a rule, well, what's the legislative reaction going to be to it? The legislature holds hearings on them, the agency presents, and then they take public testimony. And if an agency gave short shrift to a specific stakeholder set of comments, those comments reemerge at the legislature, and the legislature has the ability to reject rules or to not approve rules, therefore preventing them from taking effect. So I think the legislative review, which is enshrined in our state constitution of all executive agency rules, is really the secret sauce to why Idaho's relatively lightly regulated state. We also have a quirk in our Administrative Procedures Act where the legislature has to reauthorize all rules annually. And it's one of the last bills that's passed at the end of every legislative session, reauthorizing all administrative rules that were currently in effect. So in essence, it's a kill switch to agency rules. It had never been activated until 2019, Governor Little's first year in office. The agency rules all died on June 30th because the legislature flipped the kill switch. What that meant didn't mean all rules actually went away. It created a process where agencies had to decide which rules they wanted to republish. Republishing a rule is a pretty time-intensive process. You have to publish it in the state's administrative bulletin. There's fees associated with doing it, so it's a costly process for an agency. You have to take notice and comment. You have to provide a 21-day comment period. Stakeholders can request public hearings, and on and on. And then they go to the legislature for review again. And this was such an important process for us because, as others have said, rules kind of just accumulate over time. And somebody described it to me as pebbles in a stream. You know, rules are like pebbles. You throw a couple pebbles in a stream, it doesn't make much of a difference. Perhaps you throw enough in, it dams up the whole stream. And over the 100+ year history of Idaho statehood, we had added enough pebbles into that stream, and many of them had never been looked at again. And what this did, the kill switch, flipped the script. Agencies, rather than having to exert effort to look through their rules and find which two they wanted to cut, they actually had to exert energy to decide which rules they wanted to republish. And suddenly you found quite a few rules no longer needed to be republished because the agency didn't want to incur the expense, the time, and the effort to republish it. A lot of it was fluff, to be perfectly honest. I think all told, 75% of all rules were cut or simplified by agencies deciding not to republish them. And my favorite was our Department of Agriculture had a rule from an entire chapter of rules for the dress code for the state's deputy veterinarian, not the veterinarian, the deputy state veterinarian. And it was from December 26, 1968. So my joke is I don't know what the deputy state veterinarian did at the office Christmas party in 68 that led to an entire chapter of rules, but that was one that had been on the books in 68 and has now been removed. We also had two different chapters of Apple standards because they forgot to repeal the 1984 chapter. We had an entire chapter of rules for snails that didn't exist in the state of Idaho. We had a chapter on a lottery game show that didn't exist. We got rid of all of that fluff. And you can debate the merits of getting rid of fluff. Does that increase the freedom in the state? Not really, but when you clean out the gutters and you get all that gunk out of there and you boil it down to the rules that remain, it shines a little bit more of a spotlight on those rules that do remain and gives us a little bit more time and effort to focus on those in the years ahead and tackle some of that substance. So what the governor did is he made this practice ongoing. He issued an executive order. We called it zero-based regulation, obviously a play on zero-based budgeting. So basically the concept of zero-based regulation is under traditional rulemaking, you assume everything there is necessary and should continue, and then you accumulate things on top of that. Under zero-based regulation, we assume none of the rules are needed and they need to be rejustified on a periodic basis moving forward. So what the governor did under zero-based regulation is he set up a 5-year review schedule for each and every regulation. It has to be reviewed once every 5 years, republished and resubjected to legislative review. That way, we're always second guessing, are these rules needed? And it doesn't lead to a situation where you have a bunch of gunk like deputy state veterinarian dress code rules. It was important to the governor that zero-based regulation did not just become a checkbox, that when agencies re-promulgate these rules, that they have to go through a pretty systematic process. We have a prospective analysis form that each agency has to fill out when their 5-year rules review is up. They have to specifically identify which statutes they're implementing, so it's a little easier for the legislatures to connect the legislative intent of the rule back to the statute. They have to define the specific problem they're trying to solve and why it can't be solved through non-regulatory means. They have to do a cross-state comparison. Idaho has a lot of border states, some on the blue side, some on the red side. And what we're making them do is compare their rule to the other states. And if any area of our proposed regulation is more stringent than any of our border states, they have to provide evidence that justifies why Idaho needs to be more stringent than our other states. Then they have to provide the fiscal impact, business impact statement, and a statement on how this would impact local and tribal governments in the state of Idaho. So it's a pretty detailed process. Their prospective analysis is a public document. We publish those online as part of the rulemaking, and therefore it gives stakeholders a chance to challenge the assumptions that the agencies are making. But kind of the two-step process: kill switch, get rid of the gunk, and then look at more meaningful substantive edits moving forward by setting up a cyclical process. One thing I would just say in closing is prior to this role running the budget and rule shop, I used to run one of the small regulatory boards. I used to run the Board of Pharmacy for Idaho. And when I started, we had 100 pages of regulations. When I ended, we had 20 pages of regulations. And we got rid of all the gunk and we attacked the substance. We're one of the only states in the country where pharmacists can prescribe. We're one of the only states where pharmacists can renew any medication, even if a patient's out of refills. We have lax rules on what pharmacists can delegate to support staff. And in the 3 years that I ran that board, I watched the power of deregulation in action. We became a state where Amazon moved their central operations, well, some of their central operations for pharmacy. That created 500 jobs in Idaho. CVS moved some of their central operations from Nevada to Idaho, brought 200 jobs here. We've seen pharmacies open in small towns across the state where they're now the only healthcare provider. One example is we have a town called Victor, Idaho. Hadn't had a pharmacy in 60 years. We cut regulations, allowed things to be delegated. Victor, Idaho now has a pharmacy, and the folks there don't have to drive across the pass to Jackson Hole or up to another Idaho town. So I saw the power of deregulation in action, and I'm confident Governor Little's methodical approach to zero-based regulation will do the same for other Idaho industries.
Thank you, Alex. And I think that's a great idea that I think more states can adopt. I mean, anything that brings back the power of the legislature, which then has to answer to the residents of the constituents of the state, I think is always important, because oftentimes, like you talked about, these layers of rules and things with bureaucrats, they don't ever have to answer or have no accountability to anyone, and they think that they know best, and all they're doing is creating an environment where costs are driven up and it's harder for freedom to exist. I actually, just a little editorial comment, I just happened to have the opportunity this past summer to drive through Victor, Idaho. So I can actually visualize a place like Victor, Idaho not having a pharmacy, and really see the effects of real life effect of what some of these removal or reduction of red tape can have on a community. So coincidentally, that is a beautiful town. But it's important that we continue to have these conversations across all of our states, because there are people in rural areas of all of our states that are being disproportionately affected by these rules. We know that they have effects on people even in the larger cities and in the suburbs, but there tends to be less of a focus on that, because there are multiple options usually when it comes to city centers. But when you get out into rural areas where people choose to live, they shouldn't have to sacrifice having the ability to have access to quality health care or anything else just because of rules that are implemented, especially by bureaucrats that don't have to answer to the constituency. So I look forward to hearing more from that, and maybe we can take some lessons from that in Florida. But Mike, I think we're ready to go on to questions on some of this, if we have any. I don't know if we have any.
Yes, we have one question from the chat from Senator Rucker from West Virginia. She asks, she says, excellent info, best response to opponents who accuse you that you are endangering the public.
So I guess I could take the first crack at it. So Idaho Cutter simplified 75% of all rules, and we certainly aren't piling up bodies in the street of Boise. I'm not sure you've seen, there's been much impact. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting to me is how few rules actually had any sort of evidence base to begin with. And that's why we did the prospective analysis form moving forward. Restrictions above and beyond other states require specific evidence to justify. And there's very few things that would demonstrate safety or unsafety with many of our rules. When I was at the Board of Pharmacy, when we allowed pharmacists to prescribe, it won't surprise you to learn that the physicians had quite a few thoughts on that, and that even something as basic as pharmacists prescribing tobacco cessation drugs to help people stop smoking was portrayed as potentially harmful. What they forgot is that tobacco itself has some harm associated with it. And again, very few rules have evidence to justify them. And in fact, we're putting the burden of proof on the person justifying the rule as opposed to the burden of proof on the person removing the rule. And the benefit of having a kill switch is it flips that burden of who has to make that justification.
Yeah, Mike, if I could add something in there. Where I came from with this, I live in a rural area in northern Wisconsin, and I came at it from the property rights standpoint. What we were seeing was our Department of Natural Resources in Wisconsin working in league with local zoning authorities, like county zoning authorities, and they were teaming up to implement, first of all, to pass administrative rules, and then implement those administrative rules, and they'd work in tandem to really stifle the ability for people to use their property. And one of the highest profile ones that I did this on was in regards to the shoreland zoning law that we had in Wisconsin. And I think to the question that was posed here, of course, it was said that I was going to destroy the environment, correct? And what I would come back to them and say is that, so do you want someone who is unelected telling you how to lead your life? It is so important that the people you elect, your legislator and legislators or the governor, for them to be accountable. And the only way for them to be accountable to you, the voters, is for them to be the decision makers. Then you can come back to them, because that person buried in the bowels of the bureaucracy, really whether it's county or state, that person ultimately does not answer to a voter, and oftentimes has significant civil service protections, like in the state of Wisconsin and certainly out here in Washington, D.C. And that's why it's so important to drive this process to where the legislature and the governor, elected officials, are the ultimate authorities that are making the decisions, so that you can go back as a voter. And I would explain that time after time to people is, who do you want to make the decisions? Do you want someone who's unelected, or do you want someone that's elected? And inevitably, people really across the political aisle, across the political spectrum, I should say, they would say, yeah, we want our elected officials making that decision. But I would say also, remember the genesis of all this. I mean, I do not say this proudly, but I'll repeat it. 1911, the progressive era started in Wisconsin. And it was this notion that if you just brought enough people with expertise to the table, that they would make the best decisions. What they were doing is pushing legislators and your elected officials aside. And you've seen that really take off across America in the ensuing 100 years. And that's why it was such a hullabaloo in Wisconsin. If you remember back in 2011, when the governor introduced Act 10, we passed it in the legislature. And there was really a lot of controversy around that. We were taking authority away from these so-called experts that were better making the decisions than your elected officials. Now, not that elected officials don't make mistakes now and then, but you can remove them if you believe they make a mistake. You don't get to do that with an unelected official.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, all those points are well taken. And I think that it reiterates the point that was just made by the Congressman-elect, that what you really want is the elected officials making these decisions. And if it's something that really does disturb the freedom or the well-being of the citizens, they have a recourse, which they don't have with these bureaucrats. And I'll bring one more example to that we are going to pursue in Florida now, and that's something that we're dealing with right now, which is the mention was made of local zoning officials, but also just local elected officials, where we have had rules and regulations put in under the guise of public safety with the current pandemic. And there's what we figured out is that a lot of these emergency powers are left unchecked. And while we think of red tape in the traditional sense of long-term agency regulations and those type of things, the effects of local governments overstepping their bounds and for example, we had a big fight here with local elected officials in Miami-Dade during one of the phases of the pandemic where they decided to close down restaurants, then reopened them, and then circle back and close them again. And I just, really took offense to that and was very vocal about the artificial powers of government, based on zero science, by the way, to hamper and overregulate these businesses. And a lot of these businesses, being small businesses, don't have the reserves to survive that. But I think another thing that has surfaced as a new item under this is these emergency powers and these temporary executive order regulations that could certainly, during a time like this, not only stifle business, but really choke them to death. And so I think that should be on all of our radars going forward. It certainly will be on our radar going forward in Florida. And I've had the conversation with our governor, who's been great on these issues, but even executive power at the state level, the governor admits that we should probably have some kind of check and balance on that, because usually here in Florida, it's a hurricane, so it's a temporary, 7-day thing, 10-day thing. But with this pandemic, we've seen an extended abuse of power across the nation by certain governors. And I think we should, every state should move forward to protect themselves from that.
Thank you. And I'd just like to let everyone know that one of the task forces at ALEC that covers regulatory reform topics is the Civil Justice Task Force. And actually at this meeting, they are considering a new model policy called Emergency Power Limitation Act. So they'll be voting on that at the task force meeting later this week. Our next speaker is Clint Woods, who's a policy fellow for Americans for Prosperity. Feel free to go ahead, Clint.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to Senator Diaz and Administrator Adams and Congressman Tiffany, who I think have teed up a lot of really important issues, and really appreciate Mike Slavinsky and Ronnie Lambert and the ALEC team for putting this panel together, because I think it's, as you can tell from the last 30 minutes, we have some of the premier champions in state and federal government when it comes to reducing red tape, and really, I think, articulating the value of removing those hidden taxes that come from accumulated regulation that they've achieved in their states. I thought I'd just maybe touch on a few quick things, and just by way of background, before I joined AFP earlier this year, I served for the last couple of years in the Trump administration at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So like Administrator Adams, I'm a recovering regulator, and probably to some degree a recovering renegade regulator that was tasked with overseeing a lot of the reduction and reform within air quality and climate regulations at EPA. So very much the belly of the federal administrative state beast. And thought I'd talk a little bit about some lessons learned from the Trump administration, reg reform and red tape reduction efforts. Maybe talk a little bit about what that may, how that can help inform your states as you design, or perhaps even more importantly, implement a red tape reduction program. And then thought maybe I'd just touch real briefly on some of the relationships between federal and state regulation I think are going to be really important very soon, and the ways in which Washington, D.C., to a degree that we haven't seen in the last 3 years at least, will ultimately impact a lot of your state regulators, some of the legislative impulses that you may want to pursue, and I think some resources that may be helpful there. So I thought I'd just maybe at a high level talk a little bit about some of the things that I think we can now say. There's obviously still a few more months left in this term, but what the Trump administration has accomplished through a variety of means, and that includes executive orders like 1 in, 2 out, includes a wide variety of other executive orders that I think in many ways may be longer lasting in terms of their changes to how federal agencies operate, how they develop rules, and many in the direction of greater transparency and fairness, and sub-regulatory actions, whether it's enforcement or adjudications or memos or letters that often have the effect of a regulation without going through an open process. And I think one of the key takeaways is I think the lasting legacy of the last few years is a dramatic reduction in the pace of new federal regulation. So, among significant regulations, which has a variety of definitions, but includes rules that have an economic impact of over $100 million, the Trump administration saw about a 50% reduction in their first 2 years compared to the previous 2 administrations. So I think a lot to be applauded there, and I think a lot of lessons. I think, importantly, there were a lot of rules, especially ones adopted in the Obama administration, big ticket, aggressive regulatory overreach that was rescinded or reformed. across a wide variety of agencies, but probably not as impactful overall reduction in the size of the administrative state as you know, I could have hoped at least. And I think there's a wide variety of reasons for that. I will say I think there's kudos due and probably some lessons from some of the lower profile executive orders and rules. You had a handful of agencies adopt binding rules on themselves related to how they calculate costs and benefits for new regulations, adopting best practices for the issuance of guidance documents that often serve as shadow regulations and sort of the connective tissue of the administrative state that lasts beyond an executive branch, as well as I think a number of changes in how agencies approach adjudication and enforcement that I think are really important. We'll see if those last in a potential more pro-regulatory administration in the future, but I'm hopeful that they won't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think a lot of those changes that didn't necessarily get headlines are going to have a really important role in opening up aspects of federal regulation, and I think are things to think about duplicating or adopting at the state level. I think there's also one other really important aspect of the Trump administration reg reform efforts is really shining a light on how we think about regulation and how we define regulation. And I think in a couple ways, this is really important as you think about red tape reduction in your state. It's important to separate the process from the content. So a rule or a regulation under the federal or your state Administrative Procedures Act is content neutral. It doesn't necessarily increase or decrease the size of government. It's going through the process of publishing in the federal government, in the Federal Register, ultimately in the Code of Federal Regulation. But it's the process by which you eliminate that. And up to the Trump administration, there was not even a concept of deregulatory action, or how you calculate that, or how you evaluate and identify rulemaking that ultimately reduces the size of government and eliminates burdensome, unnecessary, costly, or outdated rules. And so I think that's a really important idea. And in many cases, it takes the same, if not greater, effort in the executive branch to get rid of red tape. And I think that's a really strong argument for, as Administrator Adams discussed, the idea of a kill switch or a doomsday machine or an expedited process for getting rid of red tape. And as Congressman Tiffany discussed, the important role of legislative accountability. And I think the best way to take back your lawmaking authority from the executive branch is to take back your lawmaking authority from the executive branch. So that can be systematic reforms like REINs. That can be other process reforms like looking at your Administrative Procedures Act or economic analysis units to help provide greater transparency and costs and benefits for rulemaking. It can be transparency around guidance, certainly red tape reduction targets or sunset review requirements, either for agencies or rules. But it also can be the legislature saying, we think this rule is bad and we are voting to rescind it or reform it. And I think that's really important. And then finally, I just make a couple quick comments. I think there's been a really good discussion so far about some of the incentives that exist as you think about whether it's a commission or greater legislative accountability or an executive branch-led red tape reduction effort. I think it's really important to think about just how closed of a loop our rulemaking process is. You've got the start of a rulemaking process either begins with an act of legislation that usually has a deadline and a very broad goal, and then turns, or perhaps litigation in some cases, turns to a progressive era style expert agency that ultimately takes some public comments, but usually develops its own science and economic information, promulgates a rule, and then ultimately, in most cases, the judicial branch defers to the expertise of that agency. So you really have largely a closed loop. So I think as you think about that, and think about ways that you can open up that process, ways that you can align incentives, I often think of kind of the regulatory hammer, where you've got a lot of really well-intentioned folks who work at regulatory agencies. They work there for a reason, and ultimately, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and if you're a regulator, everything looks like a market failure that only your agency can address. And so thinking about even just in a very limited executive branch red tape reduction program, how you can realign those incentives, how you can think about budgetary or financial incentives or sticks or carrots that can help inspire deregulation as a priority for those regulators, I think is really a challenge that we need to look to, because ultimately you often need the expertise of those agencies to rescind rules that are damaging. Just make a couple last few comments about the nature of federal-state interactions here, because I think it'll be very important. And I think Alec and everyone on this workshop has a really important role to play in the not too distant future. I think it is highly likely that in a potential Biden administration beginning in 2021, you will see many of the impulses that we saw in the Obama administration of federal standards that ultimately commandeer state prerogatives and run roughshod over your state regulatory programs. So I think that certainly extends in the space that I've worked in terms of energy and environmental issues, but I think across a wide variety of areas, you'll see not an explicit carbon tax or cap and trade program adopted by Congress, but instead use of the Clean Air Act to push and in many ways force state environmental agencies to adopt greenhouse gas standards for power plants and refineries and manufacturing facilities and low carbon fuel standards. Certainly a push for using some of the traditional tools of regulation for things like ground level ozone or particulate matter, and largely to I think, create a lot of work and a lot of economic damage that's laid at the feet of your state regulators who in many ways are very powerful advocates against that federal overreach. So I think there's a couple things to do in response. One is to think, and ALEC has a number of resources here across their task forces about how you can establish a key legislative role for state implementation of federal standards. I know there's a number from the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force, and I believe there's some similar parallels elsewhere. Secondly, I think it's really important to create a coalition. I think whether that comes from governors, I think attorneys general certainly filing suit against overreaching federal regulation is important, but I also think it's really important that state legislators and your executive branch experts take up that charge, and it can often be more effective or as effective to have a state environmental agency head push back on the federal Environmental Protection Agency. The last tip I'll just provide in this one is I think when there's I'd say unaligned or pro-regulatory federal government, I think there's obviously some places in Washington, D.C. to try and push back. I think your congressional delegation is a good one. And I just named two other federal agencies that probably don't get the attention they deserve, but are very valuable resources when you have an administration that wants to expand the size and shape of the administrative state. One is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, which is part of the Office of Management and Budget. So they've been responsible since the Reagan administration for ensuring consistency and cost-benefit analysis, and ultimately ensuring that regulations have benefits that exceed the costs. And they have a very specific process under Executive Order 12866 to bring in stakeholders during the process of reviewing proposed and final regulations. And I'll be really honest with you, there is very, very rarely state voices at the table to push back on those regulations. There are often state voices and attorneys general and governors from the coastal states pushing for more regulation. But that's a very valuable, I think, avenue to help provide some feedback, and one that's likely to stay at least institutionally relevant. And then the other that I just mentioned is the Small Business Administration has an Office of Advocacy that has a very unique role under a 1996 law called the Small Business Regulatory Flexibility Act, where they actually aggressively advocate for small businesses, file comments against major regulations, and have a unique opportunity. And they're always looking for priority regulations that will impact small entities in your state. And so thinking about some of those avenues and the ways in which your state government can help channel those concerns, the regressive impacts that regulations often have on small entities and low-income families and particular industries, I think there's still some opportunities, even in a pro-regulation administration, to help push back and provide a really valuable state perspective on why federalism is essential in many of these regulations. With that, I'll turn back to Senator Diaz, but thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that just continues to speak to the same theme, is that we, you even highlighted some things there that it's concerning that we get to the point where you have to start talking about things like shadow regulations when we're talking about guidelines that are published, and really it just goes to show that even having a president who's tried to take a sledgehammer to some of this of the apparatus still didn't really make as big as a dent as we would have hoped, just because of the nature of the beast. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us at the state level and at the federal level to continue to chip away at this and understand that if we don't, that we're not chipping away and playing offense on it, that it's going to continue to consume the freedoms of everyday Americans and their ability to make a living. So I think that's a lot of information drinking from a fire hose, but very important, and it strikes at the daily lives of Americans. So I think it's important. So Mike, I don't know if you want to. We have somebody else, or we want to go into a question session with the last. I think we had last 14 minutes here.
Yeah, I'd just like to remind any of the attendees, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, to please post them in the chat box. I'd just like to read a quick comment from Alan Smith from R Street, who says he's excited about the REINS Act, getting it across the finish line, the 117th Congress. So I can send that information, that contact over afterwards. If any of the attendees have any questions or would like to connect with any of our speakers after the workshop today, you can shoot me an email afterwards. I'll put my email in the chat. And I'd also like to remind everyone, if you'd like to watch this workshop a second time or a third time or a fourth time, we are recording it and we'll be posting that online. So you'll have access to that in the ALEC Connect. I also like to give the opportunity for any of our speakers today, if they have questions for any of each other, feel free to ask those now. I'm not sure, don't want to put anyone on the spot though. And then if there's no other questions in the chat, or if our speakers don't have questions for each other, I think that will be it for today, and I can do some quick closing remarks for some other stuff we have going on at the ALEC meeting. But
Mike, I was wondering if I could share a comment. This is Congressman Tiffany. Yeah, I just wanted to share that, kind of as a closing statement, that look for reform, look for your opportunities. You should always do that as a legislator. And if you get all the stars to align like we did in Wisconsin, where we had a conservative-minded governor and legislature, we were able to accomplish that, to get significant reform. But there are always tools. Even if you're not able to get the big reform, look for some of the tools, kind of like Senator Diaz has been talking about. There's something there in the law somewhere, somehow, that you can get things done. Look for that. And you have to dig it out root and branch. And that's one of the key things, is that while it's sexy to be passing the latest tax cut bill, stuff like that, digging this regulatory stuff out root and branch, you're not going to get headlines for it, other than you may get criticized for it. It is one of the most important things that you can do as a legislator to enhance freedom and have greater prosperity. And the final thing I would say is, also be very cognizant these days of how agencies are using guidance policy, because what we saw happen in Wisconsin, once we really restricted the use of the administrative rule process in being able to pass whatever you wanted to as an administrative rule in the agencies, they've now begun to use guidance policy. So you want to watch that very carefully also now if you see a lot of guidance coming out, because in some instances they're using it in place of the administrative rule process.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. And I would have to say that what you highlighted there is that, again, I can't say this enough. I think we need to take any opportunity we have to chip away at it, no matter how small it seems. Those things start to add up, and the bureaucracy and the kind of the bureaucratic state didn't get like this overnight. They built it up over time. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to be on the lookout for any opportunity we have to take to chip away at it. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mike.
We have another question in the chat from Adrian Moore from Reason. He says, it seems like so much of the resistance to regulatory reforms comes from industries in which they limit competition. Any thoughts on how legislators can push back against that, especially in occupational licensing and similar regulations? Yeah,
well, I think from the Florida perspective, I think what I've experienced, I spent my first 6 years in the House before coming over to the Senate in Florida. And I think oftentimes what happens is with term limits and new legislators coming in, that it really is important to have the distinction between being, a free market person who's in favor of the consumer and the market, and a person who we hear the term business friendly all the time. And I think what happens is there's a confusion there, because when you say business friendly, that oftentimes doesn't mean free market, because it's often seeking some sort of legislation that is going to protect somebody in the market or the status quo, or to put a competitor at a disadvantage. So I think it's important for especially newer legislators in the age of term limits to understand that a business friendly doesn't necessarily mean free market. If you're talking about an even playing field, yes. But if you're talking about whether it's legislation or regulation that is giving somebody either a leg up or preventing somebody from coming into the market, I think that's a huge distinction that we need to be able to make.
This is Alex. I think what I would add is I see that all the time. I saw it when I was at the Board of Pharmacy. I see it in the rules that we see now. And what Idaho tried to do, and it was kind of on the heels of the FTC Dental Board of North Carolina case, was we passed legislation to add public members to each of our boards. The regulations are promulgated by boards. Boards often have active market participants. We tried to change the balance by adding public members to those to help balance out some of those industry specifics. It's good in theory. In practice, I think it's hard to find, ardent supporters of free markets who want to serve on the board of real estate appraisers and the board of landscape architects. So, one thought, we haven't moved on it, but one of the things we did earlier this year, we did an executive order that consolidated all licensing under a single agency. So other states have done that. That's not necessarily unique. But I think one of the things to maybe take a look at moving forward is rather than having boards for very narrowly defined professions, electricians, then plumbers and so on, why not have boards that have a little bit more general jurisdiction? And it might be more palatable for someone to serve on a board with a little bit more general jurisdiction and ensures active market participants aren't drowning out consumer interests and perhaps would lead to better regulation. So just some random thoughts. One thing I'd go back to what Congressman Tiffany said about the guidance document. We were mindful of that and the potential for that when we cut our simplified 75% regulations. Governor Little did issue a different executive order that requires any guidance document to have specific disclaimers that it's guidance only and not enforceable. We require all of those documents on a single web page on the agency's website and searchable by topic so that they're transparent, but clearly indicating that they are not enforceable. And the executive order reinforces that the only things that are enforceable by an agency are statutes and rules that have gone through our legislative review process.
And I just add, I think that's a really important step. And there's some shocking examples of the use of guidance at federal agencies, including folks who've been charged under the Endangered Species Act for startling a sea lion based upon a decades-old guidance memo that defines startle under the Endangered Species Act for taking a selfie with a seal in Hawaii. But I just had, I think, on the broader point about sort of regulatory capture and whether it's an occupational licensing or really, I think, across different types of regulation, I think it's incredibly important to open up the process. And I think really important and incumbent upon a lot of the folks here as private citizens and elected officials to help connect the dots and the ways in which, and I think COVID has helped demonstrate, the ways in which government policy often is entirely unnecessary, has unintended consequences, drives up the cost of key necessities, whether it be food or fuel or rent, and really put it in terms that people understand. Because I think there's, as the question earlier, I think presupposed, it is very easy to point to a series of hobgoblins that justify massive federal regulation and state regulation, and often there's never any follow-up to see if those rules had the intended effect, and in many cases they are undermined by their own premise and cause the exact problems they try to address to be worse. But I think it's also really important that we help connect the dots that, building a new home, 30% of the cost comes from regulation, and it's similar across a wide variety of industries, and I think worth connecting folks on that front and then bringing them all to the table. So it's not just the Baptists and bootleggers that are, have captured their regulators into a regulatory outcome that they prefer.
All right, not seeing any other questions in the chat. I'd just like to thank all of our presenters today, Clint Woods from Americans for Prosperity, Alex Adams from Idaho, and Congressman Tiffany from Wisconsin, and of course, Senator Diaz from Florida moderating our discussion. I'll be sending around a follow-up email later this week or early next week for everyone that was in attendance with some of the links that were in the chat and some also to give you an easy way to email me back if you have questions for any of our speakers that you'd like to ask them offline. Before I let all of you guys go today, I'd just like to let you know about the next workshop today. There's a workshop on AB5, ABC test, Proposition 22, independent contractor policy. It's a great topic leading into 2021. The workshop title is AB5, ABC, Prop 22, what's happening, what's next, and what you need to know in the states and DC. It will be from 2:45 to 3:15. So it's 2:25 now. That gives you some time to get a coffee, hit the bathrooms, and be back for an independent contractor conversation. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you again.